Ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon we are privileged to welcome the Chief of the Royal Australian Navy, Vice Admiral Tim Barrett, who will officially open the conference. We're also excited to welcome the Chief of Army, Lieutenant General Angus Campbell, and Chief of Air Force, Air Marshal Davies. Your session moderator is Captain Mike MacArthur, Director of the Sea Power Centre Australia and Pacific 2015 Conference Director. Ladies and gentlemen, you're invited to welcome and greet our three service chiefs.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, as I speak, HMAS Canberra, our newest commissioned ship, is alongside at Townsville after completing a most successful maiden series of exercises. For the past 8 weeks, she has been at sea. Her flight decks have been busy with both Navy and Army aircraft, and her dock has been operating all of her watercraft. She carries a ship's company of about 408. 53 of those are Army and Air Force. However, in the last 3 weeks during the Sea Series, she has carried another 634 embarked personnel from the Army and the HQ staff. At times, this has lifted close to 1,400. Cooks have been producing about 3,750 meals a day. There have been 1,474 deck landings in the time. By the end of the month, I expect the Seahawk Romeo will be authorised to operate from her deck. Next year will be first-of-class flight trials for the CH-47 Chinook and the ARH Tigers on board Canberra. She's been carrying about 60 medium and heavy Army vehicles for her embarked force. She has moved more personnel, more equipment in the last 8 weeks than her predecessors moved in the last 5 years. And in December this year, we will commission a second LHD, HMAS Adelaide. I am very impressed by the work of those who built and fitted out this ship in Spain and in Australia. I am very proud of the men and women of her ship's company who are hard at work becoming proficient in all the new skills needed to operate such a significant new ADF capability. Before the year's end, she will be certified as, in all respects, ready for operational deployment. Bringing into service this class of amphibious ship and all the new capability they represent is an achievement of national significance. Ladies and gentlemen, within that context, I welcome you to Navy's Sea Power Conference 2015. For some of you, it is welcome back. For others, it is the first opportunity to attend this biennial gathering. To friends old and new, some of whom have come from afar to be with us, I welcome your participation in this significant international naval and maritime forum. I welcome members of the academic community, those from trade and industry, and those who will be reporting and recording what we say here over the coming days. Your presence ensures that we, who are in uniform, are not just talking to ourselves. Rather, we are engaging with a whole spectrum of maritime knowledge, opinion and wisdom. As I shall emphasise in this presentation, defence is a national enterprise. For those of us in uniform, this conference is a rare opportunity to stop what we do during our day jobs, to reflect upon our profession and to think about our vocation. Over the next few days, we can learn from national and international experts and our peers and remind ourselves of the context and the rationale for our careers of sea service that we have all chosen. I warmly welcome my international counterparts and their representatives. We operate in partnership with our friends and allies in this region, and I look forward to hearing from all of you, from all of the speakers who can provide insight drawn from their national experiences. I extend a welcome to my fellow service chiefs, Lieutenant General Angus Campbell and Air Marshal Davies. This is the third Sea Power Conference at which all three Chiefs of Service speak at the opening session. This triumvirate is a reminder that we in the ADF are really beyond joint. We are increasingly operationally interdependent. Australia's strategic focus must remain above, on and under the sea. The distances we need to traverse remain a key consideration. Our Navy operates around the region and the world, meeting our government's tasking. Ultimately, our peacetime task, along with other navies, is to provide what the old naval prayer calls a safeguard for all those who pass upon the seas upon their lawful occasions. In practice, we are playing our part to secure the freedom of the seas so that the commerce of the world can build the wealth of the nation. Trade is the basis for global prosperity. The Australian Navy has been, from its inception, and will remain a global navy. Our ships have operated in both hemispheres and across the world's oceans during the last century, in peace and in war. In 1914, the First Fleet Unit ships, led by HMAS Australia, patrolled the Indo-Pacific, deterring raiding from our sea lanes, frustrating Germany's ability to realise its potential objectives by military or naval means. In November 1914, HMAS Sydney was detached from a convoy protection duties to engage the commerce raider SMS Emden, which was sinking ships and blocking the movement of troops and resources across the Indian Ocean. This was our first naval action at sea as a nation. When our sea lanes were secured, our fleet headed for the North Sea and the Mediterranean. This was the start of a long history of global engagement. However, maintaining a global navy with a global focus remains a continuing challenge. Australia is a large continent to defend, and with a small population with which to do it. Beyond our shores, we have legal responsibility for an area even greater than the mainland, about 10% of the world's surface. Not surprisingly, over most of the RAN's existence, we have needed to be a prudent beneficiary of the experience and investment in research and development of initially the Royal Navy and in more recent decades of the United States Navy. Some years ago, Rear Admiral James Goldrick, one of our conference speakers, hopefully here in the audience, and an authority whom many of you know, identified the key problem that this Navy faces in the modern era. He spoke of the recurring difficulty for medium power navies being the mismatch between the expertise that we can generate and sustain ourselves and the wide range of capabilities that we need to operate. He suggests that at least part of the solution may be a revival of some of the shared approaches by which the original fleet unit concept prospered. There are many like-minded navies, culturally and organisationally similar, faced with the capability problems related to scale. We can undertake to engage in this new era of self-reliance while acknowledging that we are in partnership with many others who, like us, need to pool their experience, their resources in order to equip, maintain and operate their navies efficiently and effectively. Necessity is indeed the mother of invention. We now have a new understanding of the opportunities for greater interdependence, which allows for an international approach to problems that are hard for any medium power with a medium-sized navy to solve on its own. But we have been trending this way for some time. Our regional successes will be very much driven by how we build architecture around our design from the outset. The next decade presents us with expanded opportunities for building capability in partnership with others. More than ever, technology unites us. It enables us to be as powerfully and seamlessly interoperable as never before. The government's announcement in August of this year means the decades of shipbuilding and stopping, only to then restart years later, and all the waste and lost opportunity that resulted, should now be over. A generational shift in our thinking and in our understanding of what Australians can and will do to provide for our future surface fleet has begun. This is a national undertaking by a mature country. a country that does not duck a difficult task that is well within its national industrial capacity. But as a national strategy, continuous shipbuilding is not only about its primary purpose of building a fleet of ships. This decision also holds investment in Australian technological and industrial infrastructure. Continuous shipbuilding will be an engine of employment and a stimulant to economic growth. But at a deeper level, continuous shipbuilding unites the Navy and the nation in a far-reaching strategic enterprise. This is because continuous shipbuilding invests the Australian Navy and the Australian nation with the means to deliver a common enterprise and at the same time to exercise a greatly enhanced global influence. I suggest that this Sea Power Conference is taking place at the most significant time for the Navy in Australia's modern history. I can state this with confidence because we have now reached this point of departure in our national and our naval history where we are recapitalising our fleet at a greater tempo than has occurred since World War II. Let me give you an image of just how significant this change will be. Outside of my office in Canberra hang the portraits of 30 of my predecessors. These sepia photographs show the admirals who were entrusted by Australia to command the Royal Australian Navy from 1913 to the present. Of those 30, fewer than 5 saw the Navy expand in capability during their time in office. Many saw a slow progress of occasional ship acquisition. Most were hard put to hold on to what they had inherited, and a few saw the fleet diminish dramatically. This was particularly true as the requirements of a nation fighting a war at sea came to an end in 1919 and 1945. The first in this line of 30 was Vice Admiral Sir William Creswell. He was our professional ancestor. He argued and won the case for the Australian Fleet Unit against considerable opposition. He saw a fleet built from nothing, arrive in Australia in 1913, go to war, earn the praise of the British Admiralty and return home. My point is, only Creswell, a century ago, experienced a major fleet expansion in peacetime on the scale we will see in the decade ahead for our Navy. This building of a new Navy will be a challenge. Professor Geoffrey Till has called defence acquisition one of the most demanding forms of human activity, for good reason. Too often in the past, what Till describes as the long gestation periods and iterative tinkering with original specifications have caused delays and cost overruns. Historically, once ships were operational, the great challenge was to keep them that way. Availability is the critical precondition for decisive and distributed lethality. I continue to argue this. Our ships need to be ready for duty in the numbers needed to undertake the missions we are given. In the past, too often, new ships were fitted for, but not with, all the weapon systems and sensors they needed to make them lethal. This was not wise, and in the long run, not cost-effective either. Our future platforms will be built and fitted with what they are designed to carry. They will be ready for service across the spectrum of operations from their first day in service. Flexibility will need to underpin our shipbuilding programs so that we can adopt new technologies as they become available throughout the life of the ship. Development in stealth technologies, in the sphere of cyber warfare, and in the domains of electronics, weapon systems, propulsion systems, automation, and materials technology were impossible to predict when ships we operate today were designed 30 years ago. We cannot know exactly what technology still being developed in the research lab may be available in a decade. What we do know is that we must design ships that anticipate the need for adaptation and future enhancement. We will build ships we need for our time and place in the world. And with our global partners, we will develop the indigenous industry to sustain our fleet into the future. We have made an excellent start with our 2 Canberra-class ships. These ships not only transform the Navy's capability, they also transform the ADF's capability. They are a fine example of international collaboration, designed and laid down in Spain and equipped and fitted out here in Australia. This has been a sensible and successful pooling of expertise in this case. But they are only a very impressive beginning. The first of our 3 Hobart-class air warfare destroyers will join the fleet next year. Now, they have not been without their challenges, but these are smart ships with state-of-the-art Aegis combat systems and weapons fit to match. They will provide long-range protection and lethality. They will be the teeth of a future REN task force, and they will be in Australia's service for decades to come. But as our ships continue to be delivered, our shipbuilding plans need to be future-focused for an uncertain future. As Prime Minister Turnbull pointed out only a few weeks ago, one of the emerging characteristics of the 21st century is the power of disruptive technologies to provide new and completely unimagined opportunities. Opportunities both to discharge existing tasks better and to take on new ways of doing things. But capturing the advantages of disruptive technologies as they emerge across the national economy is a whole-of-nation task. Innovation, including innovation in military equipment, will only be possible to the extent that each sector of the economy can leverage developments in each other, and possibly totally unconnected sectors as well. Innovation comes from shifting to new paradigms rather than continuing with the existing ones. Connecting previously unrelated technologies is the bedrock of innovation. As I review the pace of technological change over the span of my career, I am amazed at the speed with which we have been able to accept technological novelty and turn it into the commonplace. Whether it was the advent of GPS, the internet, the exponential expansion of communication systems, or the power of IT technology, we now assume their availability as we await the arrival of the next disruptive technology. These technologies and their developmental systems are changing the way in which traditional expertise and enterprises operate. Their interdependencies that underpins Navy's capabilities and their support systems did not exist when I was a junior officer. All of you attending this conference are witness to the fundamental change in Navy's basic operating system. This technological interdependencies has 2 consequences. First, it forces capability managers, especially the service chiefs, to redefine their roles as network managers and systems operators, rather than simply the owners of discrete military arsenals. It forces us away from platform think to systems think. Second, it forces capability managers to see the delivery of capability systems as a whole-of-nation enterprise. Many of you will have followed with as much interest as I have the ongoing discussion about naval shipbuilding amongst naval experts, strategists, and commentators. What many of the commentators have missed is what I call the joined-up nature of the modern defence enterprise, the interconnected nature of the skills, resources, and the capabilities that make up modern military power. This interconnectedness is only going to grow into the future. Education, skills development, innovation, the creation of new knowledge-based technologies are already central to the evolution of military capability. Many of you here have backgrounds in naval architecture, heavy engineering, metallurgy, avionics, logistics, weapon systems, engineering, propulsion, and information technology. Many of us have considerable operational experience. We are, for the most part, very conventional in our approach to capability development. We're evolutionists rather than revolutionaries. Audience at future sea powers, this conference, may include nanotechnologists, behavioural scientists, biomechanical scientists, industrial designers, and autonomous robotic engineers, not to mention creative designers and organisational theorists, whose imagination will extend the scope of both agility and performance. In other words, revolutionaries will be welcome at the next Sea Power Conference. Today I've acknowledged the impact of disruptive technology on global affairs and the speed and agility with which we need to respond. The speed and scale of technological advance is impossible to disregard, and the ramifications are difficult to comprehend. As you may now appreciate, we in the RAN and the Australian Defence Force have a massive undertaking ahead of us. To address the range of opportunities and challenges we face, earlier this year I launched the Navy Strategy to 2018, which coincides with my period in office. This is Plan Polaris, which positions the Navy to navigate the future strategic environment, and it provides us with our course and our headmarks. Polaris is a strategic plan that acknowledges the changing character of global affairs and recognises the need for a more agile, flexible and responsive Navy, a fifth-generation Navy and beyond. Polaris recognises the need for technological advanced ships to combine in the fleet system to integrate seamlessly in the joint and networked environment. This is a plan which recognises the need for ships to be capable of delivering the lethal force upon which deterrence depends. It is a hard-nosed plan, one that recognises the need for ships to be affordable, adaptable and available, ready to serve the nation's needs. But Polaris looks beyond individual ships. It recognises that in the future, ships will only be entirely capable when they are able to operate in fleet systems. In the future, the whole will be massively greater than the sum of its parts. Polaris is also about people. They remain what they have always been, the greatest single factor in the success in our operations. Polaris addresses those now serving and those we need to recruit because they have skills we need if we're going to operate the systems we are acquiring into the future. But none of the issues I have discussed so far can be addressed comprehensively unless we know what is the purpose of navies and what we may be called upon to do so. So I want to speak now very briefly about value and ethics. Values stand the test of time. They draw us together and offer our profession a critical moral and ethical legitimacy. Our profession is committed to the defence of the values that unite our nation and is indeed defined by them. Honour, honesty, courage, integrity and loyalty are the values of my Navy. Without values and without leadership imbued with a moral sense, our profession would be purposeless. We must never forget that sea power is not about mere power. Sea power is not about brute force. Sea power is about service at sea as a force for good. The prosperity of our nations and their citizens depend upon our ability to trade freely across the oceans and enter and leave the ports of our customers and our suppliers as we see fit. You may recall Alfred Mann, who once wrote at the end of the 19th century that sea power is at its best when it enables the quiet and the weak to go about their business and to sleep securely in their beds. Mahan was speaking of the values that are elemental to the strategic purpose and operational concepts around which the fleet is designed. And Australia seeks to stand beside all other free nations in the promotion and defence of these values. Ours is a nation with global reach and global responsibility for defending our maritime interests and maintaining the international systems upon which our way of life depends. And central to our raison d'etre is that the Navy does this in concert with the other arms of the Defence Force and alongside our friends and allies. In the present age, as lethality is distributed across fleet systems, cooperative engagement capabilities mean that one platform can queue several, that commanders have access to almost unimaginable destructive power. As lethality is distributed, so is responsibility. This means that when we operate together, as the constituent elements of a complex fleet system, we must have an unabridged confidence in each other. We must share an understanding and a trust above and beyond the level of technical proficiency. In practical terms, we must seek every opportunity to exercise cooperatively at sea. We must take every opportunity and every chance to prepare collectively for the challenges that may confront us in the years and decades ahead. Increasing regional and global connection means no nation can expect to act alone to bear the burden of security and stability. We must look to those things that unite us rather than those that differentiate us. And as we work together to advance good order and observance of legal norms at sea. And at the same time, we must leverage the capability differences between us to deliver the common purpose. Australia is an alliance power. It's an alliance partner with the United States, and we continue to work closely with the USN as we have done for decades. Australia is reaching out to other partners even more closely with regional neighbours. This year, by way of example, Royal Australian Navy ships have worked closely with Indonesian and with Indian ships in very useful bilateral exercises, which proved that interoperability is not only possible but increasingly normal practice. Likewise, operating together to defeat drug smuggling and piracy in the Arabian Sea and in the waters around the Horn of Africa for more than 10 years now has had the beneficial effect of providing all of us with experience of maintaining a maritime overwatch in those formerly uncontrolled waters. In addition to bilateral exercises and operations, the maritime security architecture is shaped and reinforced by our maritime regional forums, which build cooperation and agreement, security and stability. Speaking regionally, I refer to the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, and the ASEAN Defence Ministers meeting, plus experts working groups on maritime security. Individually significant, the collective effect of these separate fora is of immeasurable importance. Each is committed to close working relationships, enhanced transparency, and to the joint endeavour in which we are all engaged, the peace and prosperity of our countries and their people. Australia and the Navy is committed to those multinational maritime arrangements and to every other opportunity we have for cooperation. Our obligation is to ensure that we advance our work together to maintain good order and justice at sea. I have spoken today about fundamental principles, about shared problems and challenges, and about values that unite us and that inform our stewardship of the destructive power that can be held by nations. We should recognise that we can stand together to uphold enduring and universal principles. It is our collective responsibility to ensure that we work collaboratively because we are the custodians for our government's sea power. We have the capacity to exercise it, to provide the maritime security and the international confidence that is the foundation for economic development and stability in our region. If we do not provide security of the seas, no one else will. With that thought, I welcome you to the Sea Power Conference for 2015, and I now welcome my contemporary Chief of Army to the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good afternoon, and might I extend my thanks to Admiral Barrett and his team for such a worthwhile conference. It is unusual to get all three service chiefs together at a conference, but like you, we all appreciate the importance of maritime issues to the future security of Australia and the Indo-Pacific region. In the early months of my tenure, you might not be surprised to hear that I get a lot of advice on how to do my job. All of it is graciously received. Some of it is appreciated. My remarks today will centre on some of that advice and the reflection that there is little new in the hearts of men and women but always much to learn. Later in the conference, Professor Michael Evans, an eminent Australian military strategist, will speak on Australia's maritime culture, a presentation I encourage you to attend if you're a visitor to this great southern land and are still trying to understand it. In 2011, in a paper titled On Military Grammar, the Australian Army Beyond Afghanistan, Michael posited that the Australian Army had to master 3 enduring and recurring roles: conventional combat, stabilisation operations, and amphibious warfare. He was, and I think is, right. Conventional combat in any domain remains the benchmark from which a professional force can adjust to the requirements of a specific campaign. Stabilisation operations were as much a feature of the broader Palestine campaign in the First World War as of Afghanistan today. And in Australia's maritime approaches, when our vital interests were at stake during the Second World War, Australia either conducted effective amphibious operations or ceded the initiative to our enemy. In concluding that paper, Michael offered the following advice to future chiefs, and I quote, "Every future chief of army needs to hang on his wall 2 quotations as a historical reminder of the land force's strategic constancy as an overseas expeditionary force." The first of these examples is Major General Sidney Rao's laconic January 1942 remark to the Americans that if the Japanese were to foolishly invade and land troops on northern Australia, he would respond by sending for the Australian Army's Salvage Corps to pick up the bones because there was no water between Broome and Alice Springs. The second is Prime Minister Robert Menzies' September 1950 speech to the effect that any Australian land force optimised to fight on Australian soil will always be the equivalent of a wooden gun. In these 2 statements from yesterday, Michael concludes, lies the essence of strategic wisdom for the land force of today and tomorrow. For a nation dependent upon global trade, freedom of navigation, and an international rules-based order, it should come as no surprise that Australia has long sought to realise its security through a maritime strategy. Looking beyond our shores is not a choice, it's a necessity. Not as a justification for military adventurism and the careless squandering of blood and treasure such would entail, but as a considered geostrategic response to preserving and promoting our legitimate interests in extremis. And yet, in a parliamentary library research brief of only 2004, titled Australia's Maritime Strategy in the 21st Century, it noted, if our nation and our nature is characterised by our myths and legends, then Australia is not a maritime nation. As a people, we are happy to lie at the beach and toss pebbles at the waves, or turn our backs upon it and fix our gaze on the dusty enormity of our island continent. It's quite poetic for a library report, and still true to a regrettable extent. But I would suggest in the 10 years since this was written, I think that there has been a significant change, much of which outlined by the Chief. A change within the ADF, within Australia and the Indo-Pacific region, compelling Australia to embrace its maritime culture. And I suggest with the introduction into service of Her Majesty's Australian ships Choules, Canberra and Adelaide, we're seeing the first tangible expression of that modern change. Compared to many other armed forces, the ADF is a joint force, which is essential given our size and the scale of our defence responsibilities. But it has only become the force it is today because of the consistent, driven leadership of its commanders and governments over at least 30 years. And everyone would agree there is more to do. These ships form the centrepiece of what I think will be the next forcing function to continue towards realising a truly joint force, expert within distinct environments and seamlessly integrated in the planning and execution of operations. Amphibious operations are often described as the most difficult and complex of all military activities. I'm not sure about that. In the land environment, urban warfare and counterinsurgency operations are also pretty tough and very, very complicated. And I'm sure my colleagues could cite other challenges in their environments. But to succeed in amphibious operations definitely requires uniquely high levels of joint cooperation in conception, planning, execution and support. And the margins of tolerance in amphibious operations to avoid catastrophic error are slim. Soldiers, and sailors for that matter, just don't breathe underwater. As our trials unit, the 2nd Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment is learning. One equipment pouch too wide and you don't get out of a downed helicopter, and nor does anyone behind you. This is an obvious point to those of you who have long since mastered the basics. We did too, on a number of occasions, and we were damn good at it. But Australians can suffer from a great forgetting on occasions, and so we are learning it anew. It is the professional rigour necessary to master amphibious operations at every level and across all services which presents such a challenge and such an opportunity for the ADF both within the amphibious environment and well beyond. In order to realise excellence, the ADF will take small steps, learn from others, appreciate advice and build a team of teams approach, domestically and internationally. My greatest concern isn't our ability to generate a constructive, broad-spectrum amphibious capability beneficial to Australia and our region. I am certain this will be achieved. Rather, my concern is for mastering the ability to successfully undertake a range of amphibious activities consistently, but not exclusively of those other tasks the ADF must maintain, such as conventional combat and stabilisation in the case of land forces. So to do this consistently, but not exclusively, without periodically relearning very hard lessons. To paraphrase Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, speaking of the British when he was a colonel in the interwar period, but I'm going to adjust what he said as a chief's prerogative, as a precautionary advice to my officers. Rommel sagely noted, "The Australians write some of the best doctrine in the world. It would be unfortunate if their officers do not read it." Lessons relearned is an intolerable trade in the lives of soldiers for the ahistorical indolence of their leaders. We are much better than that, and the sea is famously unforgiving. I have visited HMAS Canberra twice now, once with Admiral Barrett. It's got that new ship smell, really impressive. The current C series of exercises is proving to be an outstanding opportunity to validate concepts and build our initial capability step by step. Canberra is a great ship and it can be the centrepiece of a great capability. The quality of the people assigned from each service, especially the leaders, are immediately apparent when you get on board. And most importantly, their work together is embedding a deep culture of professional excellence and joint cooperation, a culture that will enable our best. In time, the ADF looks forward to opportunities to broaden the team, to see multilateral exercising and support operations as a routine component of training cycles. Right now, the question on the minds of Army senior leadership is how to embed amphibious competence within the force. The analysis of options is being led by Major General Smith, Commander of the ADF's Deployable Joint Force Headquarters. Additionally, some worthy advice is on offer, including from Peter Dean, who wrote an insightful paper in 2012, Amphibious Warfare Lessons from the Past for the ADF's Future, and also the Strategic Policy Institute's Beyond 2017, the Australian Defence Force and Amphibious Warfare, also by Peter, with Ken Glyman, a US Army exchange officer at ASPI. Now, both papers remind that we were once very good at amphibious operations in all its forms, from humanitarian assistance to assault. While change is in the wind, it is notable that students at the US Marine Corps Command and Staff College spend more time on the Southwest Pacific campaign of the Second World War, an Army, not Marine land force campaign, than their Australian counterparts in Canberra. Now, the key message from these papers regard dedicated command, specialist enablers, assignment of high-quality personnel, and professional learning, and they have all been well received. To put it simply, in terms of building Army's contribution to an ADF amphibious effect, what must be maintained as dedicated specialist expertise? What can be rotated within the general force? The whole of force professional standards and brigade readiness achieved through Plan Beersheba has greatly strengthened Army as a combat force. This will be sustained. Hence, these essential amphibious questions will be answered within, rather than instead of, the Beersheba framework of force generation. And I look forward to discussing the options and risks arising from these questions with my senior leaders as General Smith's report comes forward towards the year's end. So in closing, thank you for the opportunity for sharing some of that advice I've received in recent months. My team and I are listening. Be assured, Army is absolutely committed to the ADF's future amphibious capability and more generally to contributing to our nation's maritime strategy and the joint force it requires. The future is challenging, but who would want it any other way? Thank you, and I'd invite my colleague, Air Marshal Davies, to give the third address.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's warm. A lot of you are not in the Sydney time zone, and I'm therefore going to give you the 3 bullet points. That is, we are an island. We need to keep our sea and air lanes open. We can probably do that better if we do it together, and the 5th generation, all that technology that's going to come, will give us more opportunities to do that than ever before. So, if you do drift off, you don't get through the next 16 minutes, I fully understand. I am delighted to be invited to address this Sea Power conference today, and I am very grateful to the Chief of Navy, Tim Barrett, for the opportunity to address such a diverse and distinguished gathering. And Tim, I wish you and Navy every success for this major event, which showcases Australian maritime power to our friends from all over the globe. The composition of this event speaks eloquently about the nature of security challenges facing Australia and the Australian Defence Force as we approach the 3rd decade of the 21st century. This audience contains joint and coalition representatives, as well as experts from business, think tanks, and academia around the world. Increasingly, modern military forces are required to conduct so-called whole-of-government operations across a broad spectrum of contingencies. And in this era of fiscal austerity, any military force which aspires to maintaining its technological edge must enjoy a close, indeed a seamless, relationship with its business partners through shared research, development, and experimentation. This conference brings together all these stakeholders. It is thus a very important occasion. Likewise, this panel sends a clear message about how the ADF perceives its role in the future operating environment. The presence of all three service chiefs on this stage does send a strong signal. It makes it clear that the ADF regards professional mastery of joint warfare as its primary mission. And today, that implies delivering joint effects across the traditional land, sea, and air domains, as well as the emerging realms of cyber and space. These days, it is customary to adopt the expanded definition of global commons, which embraces the domains of cyber and space. This also reflects the current lexicon of multi-domain warfighting, and these concepts must inform our force structure and doctrinal settings into the future. Our extant strategic guidance directs the ADF to implement a maritime strategy in the defence of Australia and our wider interests, whether in our immediate region or further afield. Of course, the ADF is keenly awaiting the release of the next white paper. However, let me venture the opinion that I expect the white paper to broadly reaffirm that commitment to a maritime strategy. Accordingly, the ADF will continue to develop capabilities which enable us to conduct decisive joint operations in the approaches to Australia. From such capable joint forces, we must also be able to configure tailored task groups to conduct other military operations, including humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. My confidence that there will be such continuity in our grand strategic guidance is based on our examination of our history as a nation. Even before we articulated a coherent maritime strategy, we consistently implemented a pattern of strategic practice which conformed to the tenets of classic maritime strategy as expounded by Sir Julian Corbett. Australian strategic policy has always been shaped by our national culture, heritage, and values, as well as by our geography. While we must adapt to changes in the global political system, our history and our geography will continue to strongly influence our choices. As one former Prime Minister, John Howard, noted, we do not need to choose between our history and our geography. They operate together to shape our strategy. And his main protagonist, Paul Keating, framed our strategic dilemma slightly differently when he stated that Australia needed to seek its security in Asia, not from Asia. I believe that our current strategic practice neatly fuses both those views. If this sounds a bit academic for an airman, be assured that our national leaders have always implicitly understood the irreducible conditions for Australian security. None of them needed a PhD in international relations to conclude that as an island trading nation, Australia's very survival depended on unfettered access to the global commons for our security and our prosperity. Recently, I read an excellent research paper by Professor Ross Babbage, prepared for the Menzies Research Centre, in which he made this very point. From our origins as a settler society, we have always assumed that we alone simply cannot defend our homeland nor secure our wider interests. Initially, we contributed to the imperial defence by dispatching small force elements to British colonial wars. The Maori Wars, Sudan, the Boer War, all conformed to this paradigm. Significantly, this pattern was well established even before we achieved nationhood. As the global balance of power shifted, we then supported the United States in the maintenance of a liberal, rules-based global order. From the end of the Vietnam War until today, we have continued to seek security through the ANZUS alliance and numerous other partnerships. However, we also aspire to a significant degree of self-reliance in being capable of defeating any credible threat to our territory. The unifying theme in our quest for security and prosperity has been our tendency to collaborate with the dominant liberal democratic maritime power of the day. In particular, we have been reliant on the maritime power of Great Britain and the United States to guarantee freedom of navigation and good order at sea. And in the post-colonial era, we have developed vital security relationships with our neighbours in the South Pacific and Southeast Asia. The end of the Cold War coincided with, if indeed did not cause, the phenomenon we loosely refer to as globalisation. As an airman, I like Thomas Friedman's remark that globalisation means stuff happens much faster than it did before. The unprecedented speed with which goods and information circulate has also reduced the tyranny of distance. Marshal McLaughlin's global village is now a reality. The interconnected world has made us even more reliant on alliances and coalitions to ensure we meet transnational security challenges. To paraphrase the metaphysical poet John Donne, no island is really an island anymore. Technology has compressed time and space to a degree that was simply unimaginable when I commenced my career. Fortunately, the very same forces which compress time and space and which make the security environment so dynamic also assist us in gathering and sharing of information with our partners. It has also enhanced the reach, speed and precision with which we can project military power. In addition to our collaboration with friends and allies, to preserve our access to the global commons, Australia has traditionally sought to secure a technological edge to achieve a force multiplier effect. We have never been able to rely on mass, especially in the scale of our land forces. Australia faces a disruptive, fluid and dynamic environment which presents complex challenges. I now will describe how Air Force conceives the geostrategic context in which we will be required to provide air and space power. I then will describe our transformation vision with a particular emphasis on how it will affect our ability to operate with Navy. Of course, that inevitably includes how we deliver joint effects with the Army, especially those elements embarked aboard the Navy's newest ships. Entry into service of the Canberra-class vessels and the initial certification of the amphibious ready element is of profound importance. It represents a level of sophistication in our ability to conduct joint amphibious operations in our region, which we have not possessed since the famed Oboe landings towards the end of the Pacific War. Until recently, each of our individual services, I contend, was probably more comfortable and proficient at operating tactically with its allied counterpart service rather than with its Australian sister services. All of this was supposed to change after the 1976 White Paper, which called for greater self-reliance in defence of our sovereign territory and regional interests. But truly joint capabilities were never adequately funded until the recent era. That was one adverse, unintended consequence of regularly providing niche contributions to allied coalitions. However, since the crisis in East Timor in '99, I believe that we have become a truly contemporary joint force, both in structure and, even more importantly, in culture and mindset. And both our strategic guidance and the evolving nature of the global system demand that we become seamlessly joint and capable of multi-domain operations. We do live in interesting times. The state system established in the wake of the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East is fragmenting. The stability provided by the autocratic states like Iraq, Libya and Syria has collapsed. In the wake of civil war and state failure, we have witnessed sectarian violence, genocide and massive refugee flows. That is why the Syrian war is our business. Both humanitarian doctrines of responsibility to protect and realistic requirements for stability demand a response from the West. Australia continues to support coalition operations against the Islamic State. This seems likely to be a sustained commitment. Whereas state failure and sectarian violence are the main sources of conflict in the Middle East, it is the relative strength of the states that contributes to the potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific. Many strategic analysts have concluded that heightened competition between nation-states in both Northeast Asia and the South China Sea constitutes the greatest risk to peace in this region since the end of the Cold War. Those strategic thinkers like Martin van Creveld and Mary Calder, who so confidently predicted the end of the conventional state-on-state warfare at the end of the Cold War, spoke prematurely. After more than a decade of counterinsurgency, hybrid war, and nation-building operations, we have received a timely reminder that the risk of conventional war between nations remains the ultimate risk for which responsible planners should prepare. High-end warfighting continues to provide the primary rationale for the existence of the ADF, and it must shape our force structure, and it must inform our doctrine. Indeed, our strategic circumstances have been radically altered by globalisation in both its technological and its geopolitical manifestations. Yet we're expected to also be capable of responding to natural disasters and climate events at the request of our neighbours. There were over 180 calls for assistance in the response to natural disaster events in the Asia-Pacific region alone in the past 3 or 4 years. We were the first response option for our government, and moreover, we responded to these contingencies with forces capable of high-end warfighting. Whereas during the Cold War, our location made us a strategic backwater, today we are located at the very epicentre of geopolitical rivalry over hegemony in the Indo-Pacific region. According to Ross Babbage, Australia is both a hinge and an anchor in a pivotal region at a decisive moment in history. The Indo-Pacific region is the scene of increased great power rivalry. We have a direct interest in contributing to peace and stability in our own front yard. Such a complex, dynamic strategic environment also demands robust security partnerships. It also requires Australia to maintain balanced joint forces. No single service or capability provides a silver bullet solution. However, we must develop agile conventional forces capable of operating across all domains and surviving in a fiercely contested cyberspace. In such an environment, any credible adversary will seek to deny our use of space assets and blind the sophisticated sensors and communication systems upon which we are growing and upon which we rely to fight. As a professional, I will let others decide whether the very nature of war is changing or whether, as Clausewitz told us, the nature of war is constant, but that it is a true chameleon which adapts to the complexion of its social and political context. If you accept that premise, then the proliferation of sensors and information will inevitably define the character of war. That is why Air Force believes that fifth-generation technology will have a transformative impact on warfare and military forces. In the past, air power theorists have been prone to overestimate the effect of technological advances on war. Many of us lived through a number of so-called revolution in military affairs over the course of our careers. So I know I may be accused of engaging in panacea thinking or technological determinism in making the case for fifth generation, but I passionately believe that the advent of the fifth generation technology for the ADF is a game changer, providing we harness it properly. I'm encouraged by the similarities between Navy's Plan Polaris and Army's under Plan Bathsheba. We have all arrived at similar conclusions about the demands of the modern battle space. All of our responses are predicted on harnessing information, sharing a common operational picture, and seamlessly linking sensors and shooters across all domains. The challenge now is to ensure that all of our transformation visions are compatible with one another. Let me make it really clear that Air Force's fifth generation capability is neither synonymous with nor confined to the Joint Strike Fighter. The introduction of the JSF has provided the catalyst for our transformation, but it is the proliferation of sensors across our entire fleet of manned and unmanned systems that will define the fifth generation enabled Air Force. Our transformation vision was derived from recognition of that reality. We realised that it would be folly to operate the most sophisticated fleet of manned and unmanned systems in our history if they were unable to share information with one another, if they were unable to share information with anyone else. By extension, we then recognised that we needed to achieve greater synergies with Army and Navy. It seems incredibly obvious, but we have not always done it. Plan Jericho was named after a famous air raid to break down the walls of a Nazi prison camp. As the name implies, we are looking at ways to break down stovepipes. The desired end state is to create a system of systems. This time we are determined to make the reality match the rhetoric. In conclusion, I want to focus on two areas which are likely to be of keen interest to Navy. We are striving to enhance Air Force's maritime operations capability and to develop an integrated fire control capability. Most military commitments this century have been comprised of land-centric operations against hybrid, unconventional enemies. We have predominantly employed air power in its tactical roles of close air support and air mobility. The demands of such operations inevitably eroded some of our conventional warfighting skills, and we atrophied in our thinking of employing air power to full strategic effect. In particular, some attrition of our maritime strike and subsurface warfare skills has occurred. We have been urgently remediating this capability since the return of our P3s from the Gulf about 3 years ago. However, the introduction of new platforms, including the F-35, the P-8, Poseidon and the Triton, will enhance our ability to share a common operational picture across our deployed joint force, especially in the maritime domain. Through Plan Jericho, we aim to enhance joint air and maritime operations such as surveillance, strike, undersea warfare, and protection of the amphibious task group. A key element of this will be our pervasive ISR capability and our access to space assets, which will create and share the common operating picture in real time. We must develop redundancy in these systems through our regional partnerships and develop the resilience of our networks, as well as train to operate without them in a worst-case scenario. We must also ensure Air Force capabilities can provide the communications gateways or relays necessary for the surface groups to retain information control in contested and denied operating environments. In addition to technology, we need to develop truly joint doctrine and TTPs. The Air Warfare Centre, to be established in January 2016, will develop and deliver joint education and training for operators, planners and commanders to develop their professional mastery of anti-subsurface warfare, maritime strike and amphibious operations. Plan Jericho is as much about culture as it is about technology. I know Navy and Army believe this also. Ultimately, it is the people who must make judgments and respond to the challenges of a rapidly changing environment. In that regard, I wish to place on record how impressed I have been at the response to our 5th generation transformation process from our joint partners. We have already conducted significant joint experiments with them and more are planned. The pace of our transformation is ultimately dictated by government funding. For that reason, I look forward to the release of the white paper and fiscal measure contained in the next budget. For the ADF's part, we must continue to be consultative and collaborative to ensure that each of our capability and platform decisions contributes to joint capability. And let me stress, I am very comfortable with the vector set by the Vice Chief of Defence Force and my fellow service chiefs in that respect. I am optimistic that the first principles review will also help us to remove stovepipes in the way we plan for structures and procure major platforms. We must do this in a more cooperative manner from the earliest stages and involve industry in our deliberations as early as possible. The era of wasteful orphan capabilities or enablers that cannot communicate with their joint equivalents must be consigned to history. Tim, thank you for the opportunity to address this prestigious event. I look forward to learning more from our friends and partners. And to our visitors, please enjoy this wonderful harbour city. Thanks, folks.
Well, thank you, Chief of Navy, Chief of Army and Chief of Air Force. The floor is now open for questions. So a hand raised in the air is all that is required. Short questions are requested, and could you please avoid statements? Could you also wait for one of the Sea Power staff to provide you with a microphone, and would you please identify yourself, including your name and your organisation or the media outlet that you might represent? Could I ask for the first question, please? Neil James, welcome to Sea Power 15.
Thanks, Mike. Neil James from the Australia Defence Association. You did say I had to ask a question on the way in. My question's to all three of the chiefs. You've given a great presentation on the importance of joint capability development and looking at the world and changing the culture and adapting to the problems historically in Australia that we don't have a maritime culture. But our problem is that the taxpayers who have to pay for this are thoroughly imbued with this maritime culture, and the politicians who slavishly sell them the votes are deeply imbued with it too, that we don't have a maritime culture. How do you propose changing this so over the longer term we don't face this perpetual problem we have of getting people to pay for the joint maritime strategy-based defence force the country really needs?
Thank you, Neil, for the question. And I guess it's the question that is perpetually asked as to why we have these conferences as a start. But as I mentioned, this should not be just talking to ourselves. It's the fact that I would hope some of this is reported more widely as to the need for a maritime culture. But you're right, and I would suggest in part some of the issue is around the statement you made about affordability. I have a view that many consider that it is something not to be looked at because it is unaffordable. That is how you respond to this thing that might be prescribed or characterised as a maritime culture. In that regard, I think the steps that we do need to make in the next decade or so in how we approach things like shipbuilding, or how we approach the ability for the three services to work in unison rather than in opposition, is a view of at least showing that we do have an affordable outcome. I think if we are able to demonstrate that, then our arguments for why we need a maritime positioning to answer that culture will be a little easier to face.
Neil, just to extrapolate or to expand on a couple of comments I made in my presentation, I think the ADF gets it, and I think the ADF's got it for a long time. Defence and government successively through white papers get it. I think that there is now an interdependent and reinforcing effect between, let's say, the defence establishment, Australian community more broadly, which is very internationally engaged, and the Indo-Pacific region, which is a very, very active part of the world. And while I would posit we have been moving, I think that we've been moving more rapidly as a nation over the last 10 years and will continue to do so, because those three factors, the professionals, the community and its connection to the world, and the realities of the Indo-Pacific, are going to drive it. So I'm quite positive about the future in regard to seeing a nation realise its maritime culture.
If you wanted all three chiefs to respond, Neil, I think this is a relatively natural evolution. The rest of the world, our allies and those that are not our allies, have not sat still. Technology has taken natural leaps. We have responded to crises around the world and evolved against those crises. And I now see an opportunity for us over the last 20 or so years to see that the importance of a maritime structure and a maritime mindset is as important for the next 20 or 30 years as it has been for the last 20 or 30. When I sit around the table now discussing how we might afford those pieces that help us drive a maritime strategy, I listen to and see the results of a very collegiate outcome-based effect that is not on a what's best for the Air Force, what's best for the Army, what's best for the Navy. I do see a very strong maritime conversation about how we would drive towards that for the ADF.
Thank you. Next question. Get out the back. Thank you.
Hi, gentlemen. David Rowe from the Age and Sydney Morning Herald newspapers. Admiral Swift made some remarks that I felt were quite strong about coercion in maritime disputes. One particular passage stood out at me where he said that the frictions may be at sea, over the horizon, seemingly held at a safe distance, etc. But if we're not willing to commit to resolve these differences peacefully, then are we willing to accept the likelihood that imposed solutions to these national differences at sea will seek us out in our supposed sanctuaries ashore? I wanted to ask, how concerned is each of you that if we don't draw the line, I'm taking that as a reference to China in the South China Sea, call me crazy, if we don't draw the line on China's behaviour over that particular issue, that it will sort of re-baseline China's behaviour and create a new norm. Could each of you make a remark about that, please?
Look, I won't speak on behalf of Admiral Swift. He'll be able to do that himself, no doubt. The point I took out of that is the common issue that is faced at sea, and the issue around the global commons is coercion in whatever form. That can be characterised as something such as piracy, people changing the nature of how trade is conducted on the water, right down to where any nation may choose to seek to change the boundaries or do something in a view. The response is equally applicable to any of those, and I'm not about to indicate principally it's around one country or other. The issue that he was raising was around the basis for what we seek to do is to drive response and conduct around international norms that have been set through authoritative and representative mechanisms, through the UN, etc. And I think he was driving around the view that the common aspect of us policing the global commons for everyone's use is to make sure that everyone conforms with a set of rules that have been established.
David, I'd offer that engagement in every channel on those things that you do agree with and those that you have concern for is always a good thing. And I see it happening all over our region and indeed the world on many issues. It's when we stop talking that things can become very bad. So I'm a very keen advocate for engagement in all its forms.
Chief of Navy put it nicely. I thought the context, or what I took from Admiral Swift's comments, was that if we don't have a common language, if we don't have a firm basis from which to enter the dialogues that Chief of Army just mentioned, then we don't have a place to start. So in that context, it is the well-established rules of the road, if you like, that we're using as the basis to commence that communication.
Well, thank you. Next question, please. We must have a question from one of the audience in uniform. We can't let the media take over, there must be a question here from the uniform people. Now, a great opportunity to ask the Chief of Navy, Chief of Army and Chief of Air Force a question. This doesn't happen every day.
Blue, no green.
Good, thank you. Commander Carl Brinkman in the back.
Good afternoon, sirs. Chief of Air Force alluded to the fact that over the next period that presence in the Middle East may become a constant. Is that something we need to take into account for our raise, train, sustain functions and our future force structure, that being a constant for a long period of time?
Whether we're in the Middle East for a short-term, medium-term or long-term will answer itself in due course, and that of course remains the prerogative of our government and of the coalition and the demands that are put upon them. My context around that was as much that as a modern ADF we need to be prepared to do that and something else that we might need in a next opportunity for us to use the ADF effectively. It might not be the Middle East, it might be somewhere else. Therefore we need to evolve, we need to be able to manage a conflict such as we are in now, as well as do HADR, as well as do a maritime threat, to be able to support our regional neighbours. So that we should be prepared from an Air Force perspective. Should our Air Force be prepared to stay in the Middle East for a reasonable amount of time? My answer is yes. Will we? I don't know.
Thank you, sir. Next question, thank you. To my far right, thanks.
Thanks very much. The idea of the media taking over from the mighty ADF is a wonderful, novel one, but Brendan Nicholson from the Australian newspaper. All three of the defence chiefs have personnel and equipment on significant scale in the Middle East at the moment. Are you able to make any comment on how concerned you are about the intervention of Russia and the uncertainties that brings? And do you feel that our personnel, our equipment, our aircraft, ships, whatever, might be under any threat as a consequence?
No to the question of under threat. Always wanting to keep a very careful eye on that sort of issue, and the importance of coordination and cooperative planning where it's possible for external parties. Very complicated situation.
Brendan, I concur with the complicated situation, but our training, our exercising with our coalition partners, our appreciation of what capabilities we currently bring to the Middle East fight would tell me that I have no concern about the safety of the men and women who are fighting in the Middle East at the moment. But I would offer you that should there be a change in that circumstance, that it is our job, it is our responsibility to then make those changes so that my statement remains a fact.
And I'll just close out, not specifically about Navy, but in the role that each of us have in service chiefs, watching the very deliberate, and I would suggest disciplined approach to what forces we provide to that area based on what we are aware of occurring out of that area, provides me with a level of confidence that it will be matched such that we are providing that which is necessary, but without undue safe concerns for the personnel and the equipment we're using.
Right, we've still got time for some more questions. Next question, please. I can't believe we just let the media ask all the questions this afternoon. Here we go. Thank you very much. Commodore Richard Powell.
I'd like to address this question to the Chief of Navy. I think it's fair. In this region, we face many challenges, but we don't have always the necessary resources to address them. So a degree of coordination has been required between countries. What do you think the best mechanisms are going to be for conducting that coordination in the region? Do you see that as expansion of the ASEAN forum or other mechanisms? How are we going to coordinate better?
That's a sort of $64 million question that we all face. Many of those are in the audience here. There are a number of ways we do it. The dialogues that we conduct, be it WP&S, and the things that evolve out of that in practical measures, such as queues for unplanned joinings at sea, whether it is the exercises that we conduct practically under the ADMM Plus, and Australia hosted one of those in 2013, just prior to the fleet review 2 years ago, whether we continue to enhance the level of bilateral exercises that we do, as the Australian Navy has just done with the Indian Navy very successfully, which allowed us to demonstrate not just the capability of our equipment, but the level of professionalism of the personnel from each Navy, and being able to be agile and adaptive into the sort of tasks that we gave them during those exercises. We need to continue all of those three levels of engagement. Add to that a level of increased cooperation that's emerging with things like the International Fusion Centre in Singapore, the ability to bring disparate information together, which can then be used by a number of navies or other agencies to be able to solve some of those issues. That in concert with those other measures, I think it's certainly the direction we're taking. I think it is the right direction. But time will tell how effective we have been in solving many of the issues in our region through those sorts of mechanisms. But I think they are the four sort of areas and levels of engagement that we need to continue to resolve some of these issues.
Right, then we have time for one final question. Who would like to ask the final question? Dr. Connie, welcome.
Dr. Connie Bakri from University of Indonesia. My question is, in my vision, I think the competition of the air defense identification zone, which is happening in East China Sea, will be implemented soon on South China Sea. And the Australian Maritime Identification Zone, which is applied by Australia, perhaps will be followed by China. If this thing happens, what do you think that ASEAN can do with Australia actually to secure the region? Because in my personal opinion, I think it's better that Australia concentrate on this region instead of the Middle East. Thank you.
You want to go to the ages?
Dr. Connie, thank you for the question. I hold the view that at times we look at the establishment of an ADIS identification zone as being something that suddenly puts up a brick wall that is impenetrable and is somehow instantly difficult. But we have used identification zones in the Air Force for many years, for some time. They can be used in a quite positive, to quite positive effect, and managed and understood and used properly are not a necessary hindrance, if you like, or an impossibility. It's the basis of the establishment and the ability to properly, we spoke about rules of the sea, rules of the air, the ability to have safe passage in order to do our normal business. That an ADIS is established as part of that is a management factor for me, not necessarily a cause for concern.
In terms of our engagement, there's a very valid point there about where our sense of focus might well be. We've had a long and enduring interest in the Middle East. It is, from a Navy's perspective, it is about trade. It's also about our ability to ensure that we assist others who are ensuring that trade is clear through there. And our current ship up there we've had over 60 rotations of ships since 1990 in the area to do just that. But our interest still does remain in another great trading route, which is through South China Sea and through the Straits of Malacca and elsewhere. So there is a sense that we need to consider that as important as our effort in the Middle East, and we will continue to posture to take both of those areas into account.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes CPOWER Session 1. Once again, please join with me in thanking the three service chiefs, Chief of Navy, Chief of Army, Chief of Air Force, for their presentation. Afternoon tea will now be served in Hall 3, and a reminder that Session 2, Scene Setter, will commence in this conference hall at 3:40 p.m. Delegates are requested to be seated by 3:35. Thank you.